Oh shit, here we go again.
So as argued in this video, the Sassanid fall is a multi-step process. The Parthian and the Sassanid rocky relationship, the blunder that is the last great war of antiquity, finally the Islamic conquest of Iran, and the after effects of the last great war of antiquity was again general exhaustion, lacking in manpower, equipment, troop, experienced fighters, forcing new recruits to come from untrained populations, and the amount of resources the Parthians had to provide, tons of resources of all kinds to the war effort, just left them exhausted. The biggest side effect would be the massive divide begin between the Parsic and the Pahlav group, destroying any way for the Sassanids to mount an effective defense against the Arab and what to do with the empire in a very short span of time. Now, I haven't talked about my sources till now because the type of discussion should be at the end of the video for clarity, but I will talk about one book that I've referenced a lot of, and that would be a book by Parvaneh Pourshariati, in which she talks about the new timeline for the Islamic conquest of Iran. This timeline argues that the Islamic conquest starts at the reign of Queen Buran instead of King Yazgrid, the last Sassanid monarch. And I don't want to go into too many details, but feel like I would be misrepresenting your argument, but I'll summarize my feelings on the sources that I used in this video at the end of the video. In any case, the new timeline from 628 to 632 means that the Arabs were attacking during the reign of Queen Buran in the middle of the dynastic conflict going on between Shahrvarez, Parsic, Pahlav groups. Yazgrid at the time was probably just about 8 years old instead of an adult like most people say. So he was never the savior of the Sassanid Empire, and the timeline also brings up a crucial thing, and that would be Prophet Muhammad being alive during the Islamic conquest of Iran, leaving many questions unanswered, like how much influence did Muhammad place on the conquest of Iran? It's possible that Muhammad gave the original order to conquer Iraq instead of Abu Bakr, and I say Iraq because as the Muslim forces' objective was not the complete conquest of Iran-Shah or the Sasanian Empire. The Islamic conquest was focused on trade areas of the Sasanian Empire, primarily Samarkand and Iraq, like trade entrepots in Iraq and well, what would be considered near Samarkand, Central Asia, essentially, near the Oxus River. So that would be the important parts, and it would reflect a lot on the behavior of the Arabs later in the narrative. So from 628 to 632 is where we see this massive dynastic struggle between the Parsic and the Pahlav, putting different Sassanid family members on the throne. So we will see many different Sassanid family members being part of the Pahlav or being part of the Parsic camps. And we'll even have Shahrvarez like kind of squeeze on there in his third faction, allying himself with the Parsic, but that won't last for too long. So ultimately we have a situation in which the Sassanid Empire is constantly changing to different kings and different queens. For now, 628 starts his dynastic struggle with Pourshariati taking stage. And during his reign, Kaveh would do absolutely nothing at all. The Parsic and the Pahlavs signed a peace treaty with the Byzantines, and Kaveh would actually be looked over by a new minister, Feruzid, or Peyruz in some sources. And Peyruz was installed by the Parsic, and along with this and his involvement in the treaty, it shows attempts at the two factions at cooperating with. However, Kaveh was not in control of the empire in any capacity, which means the most famous fact of him killing all of the possible heirs to the throne must have been done by Feruzid. Now, why would they do this? And a possible answer could be to limit the possible challengers to the Parsic and Pahlav camp, axing off as many possible Sassanid monarchs and dynasts who could disrupt the factions that are now in place, because once in power, these factions will not give it up. In any case, most of the Sassanid dynastic line would be wiped out, all the male heirs, leaving Kaveh, the child king Ardashir. Later on we'll talk about him, two sisters, Azor Dumacht or Azar, and Buran Dumacht or Buran, and even younger Yazgrid as well, taking kind of a little bit of a spotlight here. So at the signing of the peace treaty with Pahlav and Parsic delegates like Feruzid and Farrokh, Sassanids and the Byzantines would agree to re-establish borders and a return to the status quo with the old borders before the last great war of antiquity. Now Shahrvarez would delay his signing of the peace treaty until Emperor Heraclius would meet him, and then afterwards would agree to leave Greek-occupied territories. Now, the Byzantines only asked for the status quo because they feared a power vacuum being created from the weakening Sassanid state, and it's obvious from the Pahlav-Parsic delegates that were at the signing of the peace treaty that the Byzantines pretty much knew that the Sassanid Empire was in a very, very terrible dynastic struggle. Now, Shahrvarez was not able to get any support from Pahlav or Parsic forces, and these two groups had good relations with outside forces like the Armenians, isolating Shahrvarez, and Heraclius knew this and wanted these dynastic families to fight among them, so Shahrvarez would ally himself with the Byzantines in lieu of the lack of support from these groups. And Shiryo-yi-Quebad would actually only rule for a couple months and then was killed by the plague, and because of this, Ardashir III, a child, would be put on the throne by Farrokh Hormozd, and the Parsic group would install Fairuzin as the minister of the king. But this actually angered Shahrvarez because he was not consulted at all, and then he made an alliance with Parsic and moved on to the Sassanid capital, while Fairuzin opened the gate for him and his forces, deposing Ardashir III, killing him and his supporters. He then made himself king in 637 CE, but his rule would only last for about 40 days as he had no support from the Parthian nobility, as none of the Parthians wanted another Parthian member to rule over the Sassanid Empire, and he killed off a lot of elite that supported Ardashir III, which made him very unpopular. He would only rule for about, again, 40 days, and then afterwards Farrokh would later kill and install Queen Buran as ruler with the support of his dad, Farrokh Hormozd, with Farrokh Hormozd later on being made chief minister of Queen Buran. Now, in this short time span, with Quebad, Ardashir, Shahrvarez each minting coins in their own name, each sending around diplomats to announce the new king, different groups knew of the dynastic struggles of the Sassanids, and the Arabs, having raided the Byzantine and the Sassanid frontiers during the end of the last great war of antiquity, definitely noticed the weaknesses of both of the empires, in addition to the fact that there was a lack of buffer states like the Lakhmids and the Ghashanids, and the ever-decreasing garrisons on the frontiers. So basically this leads on to the first battle between the Arabs and the Sassanids at the Battle of Uballa in 628 CE. Now the Persians were too preoccupied with their dynastic events and struggles to deal with the invasion at all. Basically it ends up in a loss. In the next battle, see that the Parsic forces are trying to get reinforcements, and they end up getting reinforcements from Pahlav forces actually, and this causes this battle and the next one to be bogged down as the two separate armies argue over what the game plan should be in dealing with the Arabs, resulting in a defeat after defeat after defeat. And during the events of Shahrvarez's rebellion, many generals and armies would leave to go defend Ardashir, leaving behind forces to deal with the Arabs, resulting in yet again more defeat. Now the Arabs will eventually take the whole Al-Hira region through a combination of warfare and diplomacy, and the Arabs would later send out letters to all the Sassanid parties calling for peace and an end to warfare. Now during Shahrvarez's reign, he would actually try and stop the Arabs, but he would use an army as described as keepers of swine and chicken and end up losing the battle. Now Shahrvarez only had support at this time from his own occupation forces, so he faced a lot of manpower issues with dealing with the Arabs, leading to an Arab victory. When Buran was made queen, however, no order of hers was actually followed, with Farrokh Hormozd presumably leading the whole show, and she would later actually be deposed briefly by a Shapur Shahrvarez. And he wouldn't actually reign for long, as later on the Parsic would install Azar to the throne in 631 CE, and when this happened, Farrokh Hormozd would actually offer his hand in marriage to Azar. This was important, as a marriage between Farrokh Hormozd and Azar could have meant a union between Parsic and Pahlav forces. Now, upon the rejection, Farrokh Hormozd the madman would actually just make himself king and declare himself the strongest in the land, and this would piss off the Parsic faction because they had Azar put on the throne for the very reason of Parsic domination. So they tasked a certain ally of the Parsic and part of the Mikron family that were related to Shahrvarez and Shapur Shahrvarez to kill off Farrokh Hormozd. A certain Razi Siavashki would be able to kill Farrokh Hormozd. Now, once he heard news of his dad's murder, Rostam basically left his position in Khorasan and went all the way to the capital, defeating every Parsic army along the way, blinding and then killing Azar, and also killing Razi Siavashki, then appointing Buran as queen because she was basically acting as an arbiter for the Sassanids until the ascension of Yazgerd III or a different Sassanid candidate. Now, with Queen Buran acting as ruler of the empire, as well as Rostam acting as commander of all the Persian forces, it gave a lot of power to the Pahlav group, since two of their candidates had such high positions, whereas the Parsic only had Fairuzin, so it did create an unequal balance of power that we will see become an issue later on. Now, after defeat with the Arabs, the Sassanids now unified with the Parsic forces, and with aid from Sambat Bragrutani's descendant Jalinus, the Sassanids were able to actually have one victory over the Arabs, and that would be at the Battle of the Bridge. Now, this victory was possible because of cooperation from all the forces as a single unit under Rostam, and probably the one time militarily the Sassanids could have pushed back the Arab forces. However, during the battle, as Sassanid forces were crossing the river, cooperation between the Parsic and the Pahlav broke down, leading to a major Arab victory, Parsic revolt, and finally Buran being strangled. After this, the Parsic and the Pahlav agreed to cooperate with each other for Yazgrid III finally taking the throne. This hurt really a lot of the Pahlav trust in the Parsic, and meanwhile, after this defeat, Rostam favored negotiations with the Arabs, especially with the exhaustion of the Sassanid armies. But he was pressured by both groups to fight the Arabs. He pushed for an isolated warfare and for commanders to bog down the Arabs before he engages. Now, Rostam with the Persian forces would send messages between him and the Arab commanders over how to proceed with everything, and it's clear that actually from the letters that they were able to tell Rostam that their intentions were trade, and that ultimately they didn't really care about the Persian territories besides the Oxus River and also Iraq ultimately. So everything else is kind of pretty much negotiable. The pressure from two groups and the Arab occupation of the Sassanid lands forced him to fight, and they also feared Rostam allying with the Arabs and then overpowering the two groups. So because it leads to the Battle of Qadisiyyah, and well, as expected, it's a loss, and even with the support of all the factions, the exhaustion of the Sassanid army, leading to a lack of experienced forces, equipment, manpower, as well as the plague that ravaged the Sassanids, killing Qabad, and on the loss of the battle came down to actually not even both of those situations, but rather the fact that there was a lack of noble, and the leading nobles were either dying or running away from the battlefield. This would cause armies that they were leading to scatter, as they had no allegiances to anyone but to the nobles themselves. And because of this, well, you just had situations where people would just leave the battlefield, like Farrokh, who would leave the battlefield with more forces from the Parsic group, leaving behind whole armies for the Arabs to destroy and conquer. Now, Rostam would die in the battle, destroying the one thing that kept the Parsic and the Pahlav armies together, leading the path for the capital for the Arab force. And after when the capital was captured, the remaining forces at Jalula would be defeated as well, and in subsequent battles this would be a common case due to lack of leadership, plague-filled, destroyed, exhausted army, with their morale being at an absolute lowest. The Arabs would actually use stipend to convince that Persian forces to defect and join the Arabs, which is a brilliant tactic. And it's at this point the two sides are collapsing. Farrokh is really the only person able to gather forces for the Parsic, and while the Pahlav are stuck with Farrokh, after defeat, a much older Yazgrid would write to both sides asking for assistance at Nihavad. And this would indeed happen, but it again was a defeat, with the infamous Farrokh killed in either doing chaos of the battle itself or from fleeing the battle. And the Arabs would deal with the surviving Parthian nobility during these conquests by either promoting lesser nobility to rule over much older and prestigious noble family, or by assisting one Parthian family in taking out their regional rival. And we will see more of this later on. It's at this point the only Pahlav leader left is good old Farrokh, who throughout this whole invasion was tasked with guarding the last Sassanid king, Yazgrid. Now the rat race is on. Yazgrid will move south from the capital, Sestafan, with as much gold as he can carry, the royal treasury with Farrokh's army as escort, eventually moving to Sistan, staying there for 5 years, then moving north through Khorasan, finally ending up deeper into Khorasan near Merv. Now it's during this period where the leaders from the Parsic and the Pahlav camps would make separate treaties with the Arabs, agreeing to the jizya, provide forces for the Arabs when needed for tax exemptions. Many Parthians were allowed to continue ruling, as is providing more proof to the argument that the Arabs did not want Iranian territory. This came as no surprise, but as the Arabs were pushing deeper and deeper into Parsic power bases in Fars and Pahlav power bases in Ray and Tabaristan, and they were eventually destroying dynastic Parthian family after dynastic Parthian family, or at least incorporating them into their empire. So, however, we will discuss later how these certain family members would be able to get better deals from the Arabs. Him and his treasure and loyal Farrokh would be where our story of Yazgrid takes place. Now remember that Yazgrid was about 8 years old at about 632 when he actually became king, and then reached Khorasan at 26 years old. So this guy had no experience in ruling and was always being manipulated by different factions. Yazgrid's game plan was very simple. It was either go to the Turks, hide there, or go to China and hide there. He claims that he could get favors from these parties, ignoring the fact that the Turks wouldn't help him because he's a weak king with no support, and China would never help him due to the fact that, well, much of the same with the Turks, but also that they never cared about the Sassanids. And you have to go through a desert in order to actually reach the Middle East. You'd have to go through the Gobi Desert, go through Central Asia, and then finally end up in Iranian territory. And even then, they have to go through the hazardous terrain of Iran. It would be a logistics nightmare for the Chinese army. A later descendant of his would try and do the same thing, but we will leave that for a separate video. With Parthian support all going to the Arabs when Yazgrid told the Persians, the Persians were practically pissed at them. Their idea was for the Yazgrid to surrender to the Arabs, allowing the king to rule over the empire and aiding his Arab overlords. And indeed, this is probably the right answer. Yazgrid didn't want to do this, believing he could still maintain the Sassanid Empire. In any case, after this argument, Farrokh would leave Yazgrid to Khorasan actually. Yazgrid refused to come with him to Tabaristan, and Farrokh would later surrender to the Arabs, aiding them in the conquest of Ray. And this was due in large part for a desire to take out a dynastic rival claiming his lands. Now, Yazgrid was all too happy Farrokh leaving because he feared Farrokh's power over him and trusted the Marsband of Khorasan, a low-birth Canaragian Parthian nobleman who was put by Yazgrid III, so he figured he probably owed his position to him. If Yazgrid surrendered, the war would probably be over, as the Arabs were just trying to catch him at this stage. They only wanted to capture him so that they could stop the Parsec and the Pahlav or any other forces from attacking the Arabs to put the Sassanids back on the throne. But Yazgrid again refused to listen. Honestly, in their minds, it was better to be ruled by a Persian overlord than ruled by an Arab, and then Arabs ruling over Persian lesser nobles and whatever. So ultimately, Farrokh, however, telling Yazgrid over and over again to not trust the Marsband and to just surrender to the Arabs. Yazgrid again didn't listen, and it kind of proves that in one belief of Yazgrid, of him being depicted as a spoiled and stubborn child, maybe the path to where he wanted to escape to the Turks really just shows that. Yazgrid, however, had little places to go in truth. The last bastions of the Sassanid Empire down south of the Canaragian Parthian family territory denied him entry, and they would later sign a separate treaty with the Arabs, surrendering it, paying the jizya, but also getting aid to take out a nearby dynastic rival. And Farrokh with the Ispa-Buthan, destroying the Mikrans and the Canaragians, destroying the Karen. Happy ending for all. Many cities later west of the Oxus would come to peace with the Arabs separately, disintegrating the Sassanid Empire further. And following Farrokh's and Canaragian betrayal, some cities and groups would instead be given a choice to provide manpower and troops instead of actually paying a jizya tax, like the tribes in Darband, accepting them from jizya tax on the year they fought and being left alone. So all around good deals being made. And with the last great war of antiquity ravaging the two empires in the dynastic struggle that gripped Iran, it was very easy for the Arabs to attack and conquer the Sassanids. Also add in a plague here and there, and yeah, it was just extremely easy. The main areas of focus for them was Iraq and Transoxania, and the presence in the Iranian territory would actually be very small. The Arab presence in the Iranian territory, preferring to only pass through it in order to get the trade opportunities, and the dynastic factionalism made this goal for them so much easier. It's at this point all the support for the Sassanids once had from the Parsec, the Pahlav, the Mikran, the Canaragians, the Ispa-Buthan, Farrokh, Peyruz, all the other Parthian family, dynastic families were gone. And after a rebellion in Khorasan, Yazgrid would actually be killed. And the story goes that he was killed by a miller, but he was probably betrayed by the Marsband or killed in the rebellion as a consequence of his unpopular policies and rule. People just really didn't like him. And the Arabs would probably let him rule too as a puppet, and the Turks and China were never going to help him without Parthian support, which again has been the whole topic of this video, is that without Parthian support, the Sassanids were nothing. The decentralized empire gave Sassanids huge advantages and huge success over all of their enemies, and they were destroyed in the end. So in conclusion, the Sassanids were probably better off as a decentralized state. The empire was very successful as a decentralized state in this period where the Sassanid monarchy didn't mess with the Parthians all too much. And the centralization of Qubad onwards really damaged relations to the point where the empire was broken up into two separate blocks. This decentralized state on multiple occasions beat off Kushans, Hephalites, Turkic tribes, and Byzantines all at the same time. No pushover at all. And if these Sassanid kings wouldn't agitate or kill off Parthian dynasts, then maybe there wouldn't be souring of relations during the reigns of Hormozd and Khosrow II, in addition to the Sassanids continuing the war for 3 decades. But they exhausted their own forces and they got too cocky. In fact, Khosrow II got too ambitious. They exhausted a lot of the Parthian forces, and that led to the Islamic conquest being so easy. Again, the Parthian nobility would also rule through the Arabs after Yazgrid. In fact, Farrokh would have actually control over an independent kingdom in Tabaristan, and Arab colonization was small in Iran and Shah, in comparison to Iraq and Egypt, improving the trade reason even more. So the Arabs coming during the end of the last great war of antiquity and the dynastic struggle plaguing the Sassanids, and also cue in the plague again, was probably the best time for them to strike, stopping them from suffering the same fate as the Sassanid Empire. Now, much like the Parthians and the Sassanids, the Romans would also lose territories where alienated elite would ally with the Arabs, particularly in Syria, Egypt, and Africa, where they would develop strong ethnic differences as well as confessional differences with the culture of the Byzantine Empire as well as with the Byzantine Church. However, because the military apparatus of the empire was not dependent on these nobility, as well as the Arabs not being as motivated to cross through to Europe as they were to get to the Oxus, I think that basically stops the Arabs advancing into the Byzantine Empire, so stopping them from suffering the same fate as the Sassanid Empire. But that's an oversimplification, and I feel like I'll probably do a video individually on the Byzantines as to why they were never invaded in totality by the Arabs. And really, under the queenship of Buran and Rostam, the Sassanids had the best chance to win, or if Yazgrid just surrendered. Now, with the descendants of the Sassanids, we'll leave for a future video. I foreshadowed their involvement with the newly created Muslim empire, but this video is getting too long, and keeping in mind that they didn't have Parthian support, and the Sassanid Empire was a decentralized confederacy between Sassanids and Parthians. Without Parthian nobility, there is no Sassanid Empire. The power of nobility was so great that their own capitals were just as rich and powerful as the Sassanid monarchs' kingly cities. That's basically all I have to say, and now I know that there are popular videos that are in direct conflict with the things that I have said, and that's for another time. For now, this video is done, and thank you guys for watching, and it took about a year to make this, mostly because of my laziness and but I'm happy to actually release this baby, and I'll try to get out future videos faster. If you want to hear my opinions on the sources, stick around, and I'm finally glad to give this overlooked empire some justice that it deserves. And keep in mind that the major crime here that makes it hard to peg down Sassanid information is that there's just a lack of information, and it's only now from newer sources that people have been able to expound on the history of this great empire. Bye bye.